Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The old farmhouse stood skeletal against the bruised South Carolina sky, a forgotten relic swallowed by the woods off Scuffletown Road. Its windows were vacant eyes, its porch a sagging mouth groaning under the weight of decay. For years, it had been a haunt for teenagers seeking the illicit thrill of a secret party, its walls echoing with laughter and the clinking of bottles. But on the night of October 26, 2016, the house held a secret far darker than adolescent rebellion. A silence had fallen over it, thick and heavy with a horror that would soon spill out and stain the quiet community of Simpsonville forever. Deep within the house, in the damp, earthen-smelling basement, two of Cat Eye Blauvelt's friends had followed a desperate hunch. The air was cold, stagnant. Their flashlight beams cut through the oppressive darkness, dancing over discarded beer cans and graffiti-scarred walls. Then, the light snagged on something in the center of the room. It was a rectangular concrete box, a strange, utilitarian object in the surrounding squalor. As they drew closer, a shape within the box resolved itself into a human form, unnaturally folded, crammed into the cold confines like a discarded doll. The frantic 911 call that followed was a choked, terrified whisper, a sound that marked the end of a desperate search and the beginning of an agonizing quest for justice. "We found my friend Cat Eye, dead in the house," the voice stammered, cracking with a grief too new, too raw to comprehend. When investigators arrived, the scene that greeted them was a tableau from a horror movie. 22-year-old Catherine Cat Eye Blauvelt, a woman her mother described as a 5 feet 1 inch free spirit, a teeny little thing full of sunshine, had been brutalized. The cause of death was a single, savage stab wound to the neck, inflicted with such force that the blade had broken off and remained lodged within her, a final, cruel punctuation mark on a life cut short. Her body had been dragged through a basement window and unceremoniously dumped in the trash-strewn box. As her mother, Patty Piver, would later say, her voice hollowed by an unimaginable loss, "I was totally empty inside. She did not deserve to be murdered." The investigation immediately turned to one man, her estranged husband, John Tufton Blauvelt. He was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army, a recruiter whose decorated uniform and stories of deployment in Iraq had once made him a figure of admiration in the small city of 20,000. When investigators Keith Moorcraft and Cheryl Schofield went to his home to deliver the news, they were met not with the shock and devastation of a grieving husband, but with a chilling, unsettling calm. As Moorcraft recounted, John didn't ask normal questions such as, "Where did you find her? How did she die?" He seemed unsurprised, almost put off by their presence. When he saw their recording device, his only real question was not about his murdered wife, but about himself. "Am I being charged with a crime?" In that moment, the investigators felt a cold certainty settle in their bones. This was their man. But just as their case was beginning, John Blauvelt, a man trained in combat and survival, vanished. And he was not alone. With him was his new girlfriend, a 17-year-old high school student named Hannah Thompson. The hunt had begun. The story of Cat Eye and John Blauvelt did not begin with violence, but with the quiet promise of a small-town romance. They met in 2014, just yards from John's recruiting office, at a sub shop where Cat Eye worked. She was 20, he was 26. To Cat Eye's family, he was the embodiment of principle, a man willing to sacrifice for his country. He was handsome, charismatic, and seemed to have, as a friend would later put it, all his ducks in a row. Cat Eye, with her infectious laugh and passion for animals, was smitten. "She's lovable, caring, funny," her mother said. "Who wouldn't fall in love with her?" John, the larger-than-life public face of the army, convinced Katai to enlist. She was proud to follow in his footsteps, but her military dreams were cut short after just 2 months when a spinal issue led to a medical discharge. Despite this setback, their relationship deepened, and one day, Katai stunned her family with an announcement. She says, "Oh, by the way," Patty Piver recalled, "me and John got married today." And I'm in shock. They had gone to the courthouse, a swift, unceremonious union that left her family unsettled. They had never warmed to John, finding him distant and uninterested in getting to know them. Their unease would soon prove to be a dark premonition. The honeymoon was over almost before it began. They were supposed to build a life together in the 4-bedroom home John owned in Fountain Inn, a neighboring town. Katai dreamed of a family, of filling the house with the laughter of children. But the only kids who filled the house were the teenagers John invited over. It became a party house, a notorious hangout for students from Hillcrest High School, where John often worked as a recruiter. Allie Somerville, a friend of Katai's who was only 16 at the time, described a scene of constant indulgence. "We were just smoking weed all day, every day," she said. At times, there was also alcohol, all facilitated by the U.S. Army recruiter the kids saw as a role model. Katai's dream house had become a nightmare. The constant partying frustrated her, and she told John it had to stop. But as Katai and John drifted apart, another figure was there to stoke the flames of their discord, Hannah Thompson. Hannah absolutely despised Katai, investigator Schofield would later say. As Katai pulled away, Hannah drew closer to John, becoming his puppy, willing to do anything he asked. The situation became untenable. After less than 3 months of marriage, Katai moved out. Hannah wasted no time moving into John's bedroom. The facade of the respectable soldier was beginning to crack. In February 2016, Hannah's father, concerned that he hadn't seen his 17-year-old daughter in 2 weeks, called the police. When officers arrived at Blauvelt's house, he refused to come out, ordering the teenagers inside to lock the doors. The scene escalated into a standoff, with armed officers surrounding the house of an Iraq War veteran. "John Blauvelt, come out of the house with your hands up," they yelled. Allie Somerville, terrified, hid inside. "There were weapons drawn and everything," she recalled. John eventually surrendered and was arrested, charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. His soldier's image was replaced with a mugshot. "He's the exact opposite of what everybody thought he was," Patty Piver said, the bitter truth dawning. The day of his arrest, Katai revealed an even more terrifying secret to the police. A month earlier, during an argument, John had pointed a gun at her head. He was going to kill her, her stepsister Jennifer Piver recounted, and also threaten the family. This revelation led to a domestic violence charge and a restraining order. For John Blauvelt, this was the ultimate betrayal. The Department of the Army suspended him from his recruiting duties, cut his pay, and reassigned him to a small back office, pending an investigation that could end his career. He was furious, and he blamed Katai for everything. He blamed her for ruining his life, Jennifer Piver said. His anger was not a private matter. He was vocal, telling friends repeatedly that he was going to kill Katai. He said that she ruined his military career. That's all he's ever wanted to do in life, Allie Somerville testified. "You destroy my career, I'm going to destroy you." No one thought he would actually go through with it, but as the autumn leaves began to fall in October 2016, John Blauvelt was a man with a grudge, a plan, and a target. Katai, who had moved back in with her mother and was planning to file for divorce, was living in the shadow of a threat she could not escape. Her only reason for returning to the house she had shared with John was to care for her dog, Jupiter. And each time she went, her mother was terrified that something would happen to her. On October 24th, 2016, Katai left her job at PetSmart and vanished. The frantic calls went to voicemail. Her mother, her heart seizing with a fear she had harbored for months, reported her missing, telling the officer on the phone that she was suspicious of John Blauvelt. The waiting was an agony. "I didn't think she was alive anymore," Patty Piver admitted. 2 nights later, her worst fears were confirmed in the cold, dark basement of an abandoned house. John Blauvelt's flight from justice was swift and audacious. Shortly after his initial chillingly calm interviews with police, he hit the road. His red GMC Yukon, with 17-year-old Hannah Thompson in the passenger seat, sped west, leaving behind a murder scene and a grieving family. He was a fugitive, a trained soldier with combat and survival skills, now using that government-provided training to evade the very system he had once sworn to serve. The U.S. Marshals were called in, and the hunt for the cocky, narcissistic killer began. John thought, "We were never going to find him," said U.S. Marshal Will Cook. The initial phase of the investigation was a frustrating game of cat and mouse. License plate readers picked up hits on his truck in Texas and New Mexico, but by the time authorities could respond, he was gone. He and Hannah were ghosts on the open road. But the romance of life on the lam, if it ever existed, quickly soured. The fairy tale devolved into a grim reality. In the Pacific Northwest, John got the Yukon stuck in the mud on a mountain. They were forced to hike for miles, reduced to panhandling for spare change to survive. It was during this desperate, nomadic existence that John's bravado cracked, and he confessed the full horror of what he had done to his young, impressionable companion. He told Hannah that he had killed Cat-Eye at the abandoned house. He told her the knife had broken off in her neck. He told her that Cat-Eye's last words were a plea, a promise that if he let her go, she wouldn't call the police. He wept and screamed, trying to twist his monstrous act into a twisted gesture of love for Hannah. He was like, "I did that for you," Hannah later told investigators, like trying to make me feel like it was my fault. He had also manipulated her into helping him after the fact, asking her to help hide Cat-Eye's car, and telling her that if she lied to the police, he would keep her safe. After a month on the run, reality set in for Hannah. John abandoned her in Eugene, Oregon. She contacted a family friend, and on December 12, 2016, she was found safe and returned home to Simpsonville. Investigators were waiting. In a series of interviews, the story began to spill out, though it was a tangled mess of conflicting emotions and loyalties. She was a 17-year-old who had been psychologically manipulated by an older man, but she was also an accomplice who had lied to protect a killer. "I still really care about him, even though he did something like really bad," she admitted, crying. "Like I feel like I should hate him. A part of me does, but a part of me just keeps thinking about how he used to be." For the investigators, Hannah was the key. They needed her to find John, so they played a long game, choosing not to charge her immediately. They hoped she would lead them to him. But the months turned into years. John Blauvelt seemed to have disappeared off the face of the earth. The case went cold. Investigator Moorcraft retired, the open case a source of lingering frustration. Cat-Eye's family lived in a state of suspended grief, the hope of justice dwindling with each passing day. "I never really thought that they would get him," Patty Piver said. "But the marshals never gave up. He's beating us," Marshal Cook said, "and we don't like to lose." The break they had been waiting for came 6 years after the murder. In 2022, Hannah, now a young woman, finally revealed a crucial secret. She had been in regular contact with John for years after she returned home, first on Facebook Messenger, then on Snapchat. Their conversations had ended in 2019, but she had information. She believed he was still in Oregon, living with another woman. "Honestly, she's in danger too," Investigator Schofield told her. This was the lead the marshals needed. A dedicated cold case team focused their efforts on Medford, a small city in the northwest. They traced a phone number John had used to a mystery woman, which led them to an address. They began a stakeout. On the quiet morning of July 20th, 2022, they saw a man who matched John's description walk out of the house shirtless. The marshals had a key piece of identifying information, a distinctive pirate tattoo. As the man walked down the driveway, they moved in. "Police, show us your hands." "Get down on the ground," they commanded. The man's eyes went wide with pure shock. He dropped to the ground and was quickly handcuffed. He insisted they had the wrong man. "I'm Ben Klein," he said, sticking to his alias. But a mobile fingerprint scanner told a different story. In less than 5 minutes, Ben Klein became John Blauvelt once again. "He knew it was over," said Marshal Chris Tamayo. Inside the house, on the nightstand, was a loaded handgun. It was a clear indication, the marshals believed, that if they hadn't caught him by surprise, he would have put up a fight. Later that day, his new girlfriend returned home. She was visibly shaking, crying, her world collapsing as she learned that the man she had loved and lived with for 6 years was a wanted murderer. The news hit Simpsonville like a thunderclap. After 6 long years, the monster was in custody. The trial of John Blauvelt, held in September 2024, was the final, gut-wrenching chapter in a story that had haunted a family and a community for 8 years. The prosecution, led by Kinley Abbey and John Meadors, methodically laid out their case. They presented the chilling X-ray showing the knife blade lodged in Catai's neck. They showed the jury the blue shirt Catai was wearing, the small hole in the collar where the blade had entered. They argued that John had killed Catai as an act of revenge, blaming her for the destruction of the military career that had defined him. And they put their key witness on the stand, Hannah Thompson. Now in her mid-20s, Hannah faced the man she had once loved and fled with. She admitted to helping him hide Catai's car and lying to police. Then, her voice trembling, she recounted his confession. He had told me that he killed her. He stabbed her in the neck. She told the jury that he had thrown Catai's phone into a puddle of water at the abandoned house and covered her blood with dirt. The defense, led by Paul Neely and Anna Walker, attacked Hannah's credibility, forcing her to admit that she had lied repeatedly to friends, family, and the police over the years. They pointed out the lack of John's DNA at the crime scene. They even tried to dismiss the damning entry found in a journal John kept while on the run, a journal that contained the stark, bold words, "I did it." They argued it was a work of fiction, filled with poems and fantasy stories. But the prosecution had a powerful rebuttal. Hannah Thompson was testifying with no deal, no promise of leniency for the 5 felony charges she was facing, which carried a potential sentence of 55 years. "She got up here and testified," Kinley Abbey told the jury, "and she told you because she thought it was the right thing to do." After a 4-day trial, the jury deliberated for 5 hours. The verdict was unanimous. As to the charge of murder, the court clerk read, "We the jury unanimously find the defendant, John T. Blauvelt, guilty." In the quiet, emotional courtroom, Catai's family wept. "As soon as the jurors got out, I just started crying," Patty Piver said. John Blauvelt was sentenced to life in prison without parole. "He's a monster," his victim's mother said, her voice filled with a mixture of grief and relief. She was helpless. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but the pain endures. Catai's family must live forever with the memory of her stolen life. John Blauvelt is appealing his conviction, a final, futile act of defiance from a man who believed he could outrun his crimes. And Hannah Thompson, the teenager who got swept up in a killer's orbit, awaits her own trial, her future still uncertain. The story of Catai Blauvelt is a heartbreaking reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a uniform and a smile, of the devastating consequences of domestic violence, and of a family's unbreakable love, which fought for 8 long years to see that a daughter's memory was honored with justice. Story 2. The fall of 2006 was settling over Barrie, Ontario, with a familiar chill, painting the leaves in hues of amber and crimson along the shores of Lake Simcoe. In a quiet apartment complex on Coulter Street, the changing season mirrored a far more turbulent and destructive storm brewing within the mind of Frances Elaine Campione. At 33, Elaine was a woman adrift, caught in the wreckage of a shattered marriage and a custody battle that had consumed her world. Her life, which had once held the promise of domestic simplicity, had spiraled into a vortex of paranoia, fear, and a deep-seated resentment that was poisoning everything it touched. At the center of this storm were her 2 daughters, 3-year-old Serena and 19-month-old Sophia. They were the anchors of her life, and in the distorted reality of her thoughts, they were also the prize in a war she felt she was about to lose. Elaine's journey had begun far from the manicured suburbs of southern Ontario, in the quiet, rural community of Coles Island, New Brunswick. Hers was a normal enough childhood, but a restlessness led her to Ontario around the age of 20, seeking work and a new beginning. She found employment as a nanny, a role that seemed to suit her, and held other jobs to make her way. In 2000, she met Leo Campione. Their relationship blossomed into marriage, and soon they settled in the nearby town of Bradford. The births of their daughters, Serena and then Sophia, should have cemented their family unit. But instead, cracks began to appear, widening into chasms that would prove impossible to cross. By 2006, the marriage was over. Leo had moved out, and the couple was entangled in a divorce that was anything but amicable. The primary battlefield was the children. Elaine had moved with the girls to the Coulter Glen apartments in Barrie, but the separation did not bring peace. It only intensified the conflict. Leo grew increasingly concerned about his daughter's well-being under Elaine's care. He alleged that the living conditions in her apartment were substandard and, more alarmingly, that Elaine was in the midst of a severe mental health crisis. He had seen signs of it for months, a slow and terrifying unraveling that now seemed to be accelerating. Elaine's behavior had become erratic and frightening. She was hospitalized in psychiatric wards, and court records would later show a history of suicide attempts. Her grip on reality was slipping, replaced by a world of terrifying delusions. She believed people were trying to kill her. She was convinced that shadowy figures were plotting to steal her daughters. Her paranoia took on bizarre forms. She forbade Serena from touching anything red and spoke of seeing aliens. To the outside world, these might have seemed like the ramblings of a troubled mind, but to Elaine, they were dire warnings of an impending threat. And in her mind, the greatest threat of all was Leo. The custody battle was the crucible where her love for her children and her hatred for her ex-husband were fused into a single, terrible purpose. Leo, desperate to protect his daughters, had escalated his legal efforts. Just a week before the tragedy, he had filed a motion with the court, pleading for more access to the girls and demanding the appointment of a children's lawyer to represent their interests. He saw the danger signs, the red flags fluttering violently in the wind of Elaine's instability. A court date was set. It loomed over Elaine not as a chance for resolution, but as a day of judgment where she was certain she would lose everything. The idea that Leo, the man she now saw as a hideous monster and the devil, could win custody of her girls was an unbearable, apocalyptic thought. It was a thought that would curdle into a horrifying resolution. On October 2nd, 2006, inside that Barrie apartment, Elaine Campione made a decision. She was not just going to prevent Leo from getting the children. She was going to make him pay, to inflict a wound so deep it would never heal. She decided to create a final testament, a monument to her pain and her rage. She took out her video camera. The footage she recorded is a chilling portal into a mind on the edge of abyss. In segments filmed before the act, she speaks directly to the camera, her words a torrent of vitriol aimed at her absent husband. She details his alleged abuses, her voice a mixture of anguish and venom. Then, the camera keeps rolling as she turns her attention to her daughters. She coaxes them to play, to say goodbye, their innocent voices a haunting counterpoint to the darkness that was about to engulf them. According to her own account, she then turned off the camera. She led her daughters to the bathroom. The room, a place of bubbles and bath toys, became a chamber of horrors. One by one, she held Serena and Sophia under the water in the bathtub until their struggles ceased. She drowned them, but her work was not finished. This was not just about death, it was about sending a message. She carefully dried her daughters' small bodies and dressed them in fresh pajamas. She adorned them with jewelry. She carried them to her own bed and laid them down side by side, their hands clasped together as if in eternal sleep. Around them, she arranged a rosary and a photo album, creating a serene, almost angelic tableau. It was a grotesque parody of maternal love, a carefully staged scene of tragedy designed for maximum impact. Her final act was to turn the violence upon herself. She tried to overdose, hoping to join her daughters in the silence she had created for them. But she failed. A day and a half later, she woke up. The first thing she did was turn the camera back on. The living room was filled with the indifferent light of a new day. "I tried to overdose, but it didn't work," she confesses to the lens, her voice choked with sobs. "Those poor girls, they were my life." For a moment, the weight of what she had done seemed to crush her. On October 4th, 2 days after she had murdered her children, Elaine Campione finally picked up the phone and called the police. When officers arrived, they found the 2 little girls exactly as she had left them, a picture of innocence frozen in time. In the same room, they found the videotape. At the police station, during her interrogation, she feigned ignorance, pretending she had no idea how her daughters had died. But the videotape told the real story. It was a confession, a motive, and a verdict all in one. It was the evidence that would seal her fate. The trial of Elaine Campione began 4 years later, in the fall of 2010. It lasted 7 grueling weeks, a public dissection of a family's destruction. The prosecution, led by the Crown, charged her with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The defense, led by lawyer Mary Kramer, did not dispute the central fact that Elaine had killed her daughters. Their entire case rested on a different argument, that she was not criminally responsible by reason of mental disorder. The jury was presented with the 2 starkly different portraits of Elaine Campione. The Crown painted her as a vengeful ex-wife, a woman so consumed by hatred that she murdered her own children as the ultimate act of revenge against her husband. They argued that the timing was no coincidence. She killed Serena and Sophia just days before the family court appearance where Leo was expected to gain more access to them. The videotape was their star witness. "Leo, there, are you happy?" she sneers on the tape. "Everything's gone. The idea that you could actually have my children. God believes me and God's taking care of them now. You beat your wife to death and your children, and don't you ever, ever, ever forget it." This, the prosecution argued, was not the voice of insanity, but the voice of calculated, cold-blooded revenge. The defense, in turn, built a narrative of a woman broken by abuse and mental illness. They detailed her stays in psychiatric wards, her delusions, her paranoia. They argued that her mental disorder was so severe that she was incapable of understanding that what she was doing was morally wrong. In her twisted reality, she was not murdering her children. She was saving them from a fate she believed would be far worse, life with their father. One expert for the defense suggested it was an altruistic homicide, an act born of a profoundly disordered love. The courtroom was a theater of immense sorrow. The jury was shown over 100 photos from the crime scene. The images of Serena and Sophia, lying hand in hand, surrounded by stuffed animals, were so devastating that one juror wept openly, and the judge had to call for a break on 2 separate occasions. Elaine herself broke down, her body shaking with sobs as the evidence of her actions was laid bare. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Their task was immense. They had to navigate the murky waters of the Canadian Criminal Code regarding mental disorder. The law did not just require them to find that Elaine had a mental illness. They had to decide if that illness rendered her incapable of knowing that her actions were wrong by the standards of ordinary society. The deliberations were long and arduous. The jury deliberated for nearly a week. They came back twice with questions for Justice Alfred Stong, struggling with the legal definitions. On the 4th day, they asked for clarification of the phrase morally wrong. The judge explained that the test was not whether Elaine believed her actions were justified in her own mind, but whether she was capable of knowing that society viewed them as wrong. The weight of the decision was palpable. One juror burst into tears when she was denied a request to call her son on his 7th birthday, a stark reminder of the childhoods that had been extinguished. Finally, on November 15, 2010, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson delivered the verdict. Guilty, on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Elaine Campione's body began to shake uncontrollably. As the verdict sank in, she broke down, sobbing loudly and burying her head in her hands in the prisoner's box. The conviction carried an automatic sentence: life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The judge himself, visibly moved, acknowledged the unimaginable facts of this case and the inordinately tragic circumstances. He spoke of the breakdown of the family unit and, in a moment of startling empathy, remarked, "It is more than disconcerting to think that if Ms. Campione had not been so abused, so used and discarded as a person, her 2 daughters could still be alive." He ordered that the state cover the cost of counseling for the jurors, a testament to the trauma they had endured. Leo Campione was not in court for the sentencing, but his voice echoed through the room in a victim impact statement read by the Crown Attorney. "Serena and Sophia were my life, and they still are," he wrote. "I found my place in life, and my peace was with them." He spoke of the image of his daughter's last moments, an image that he said will haunt me forever in ways I can't begin to describe. He missed seeing them run towards him, yelling, "Daddy, Daddy." He concluded his statement with a promise: "I will carry them in my heart until we meet again." His family's statement added to the chorus of grief, describing the emptiness of losing Serena and Sophia as something they live with every day. Elaine Campione appealed her conviction, arguing that the judge had made errors in his instructions to the jury regarding the not criminally responsible defense. In 2015, the Ontario Court of Appeal dismissed her appeal, upholding the jury's verdict. The court ruled that the trial judge had properly instructed the jury and that they were made well aware of the legal standard they had to apply. The verdict stood. In the years that have followed, the story has not entirely ended. In 2019, and again in subsequent years, the Parole Board of Canada granted Elaine Campione escorted absences from prison for personal development. For the grieving father and the community that was so deeply affected by the crime, these decisions are a painful reminder that while the legal chapter may be closed, the story of Serena and Sophia, 2 little girls who became pawns in a war they could not understand, is one of loss that can never be undone. Story 3. The Olivier Café, nestled within the glittering consumerist heart of Jakarta's Grand Indonesia shopping mall, was a sanctuary of curated cool. The air hummed with the quiet clink of porcelain, the murmur of sophisticated conversation, and the rich, intoxicating aroma of artisanal coffee. It was a place for the city's bright young things to see and be seen, a backdrop for casual meetings and carefully orchestrated social rituals. On the afternoon of January 6, 2016, this chic enclave was set to become the stage for a crime so cold, so audacious, that it would transfix a nation and turn the simple act of drinking coffee into a symbol of ultimate betrayal. Wayan Myrna Salihin, 27 years old, was a woman radiating the quiet confidence of a life falling perfectly into place. Born to a wealthy businessman, Eddie Darmoin Salihin, she was a newlywed, having married her love, Arif Soamarco, just weeks before. She and her twin sister, Sandy, were the beloved daughters of a prominent family, their future stretching before them like a sunlit path. That afternoon, Myrna was looking forward to a simple pleasure, catching up with old friends over a cup of coffee. One of those friends was Jessica Kamala Wongso. Jessica was an enigma, a woman whose life was a study in contrasts. Like Myrna, she was 27, and the two had met years earlier while studying at the Billy Blue College of Design in Sydney, Australia. While Myrna had returned to her life in Jakarta, Jessica had stayed on, becoming a permanent resident of Australia, her life there a tangled web of ambition, volatile relationships, and a growing darkness that few could see. She was now back in Jakarta, and this reunion at Olivier was a chance to reconnect with the friends she had known in another life. At 3:33 p.m., Jessica arrived at the mall, her movements captured by the ubiquitous, unblinking eyes of security cameras. She was alone, and remarkably early for the planned 5 p.m. meeting. After making a reservation, she wandered through the mall's gleaming corridors, her shopping bags from a luxury soap store a mundane prop in the sinister play she was about to direct. At 4:14 p.m., she returned to the cafe, taking a seat at the reserved table. She ordered the drinks, 2 cocktails and 1 Vietnamese iced coffee, Myrna's favorite. For the next hour, Jessica waited. As the minutes ticked by, she performed a strange, subtle choreography. She shifted in her seat, adjusted her hair, and then, in a move that would become a focal point of a massive murder trial, she arranged her 3 large paper shopping bags on the table. They formed a wall, a flimsy but effective curtain that shielded the drinks from the view of the cafe's security cameras. Behind this screen of consumerism, in the blind spot she had so carefully created, the trap was set. At 5:16 p.m., Myrna arrived, accompanied by their mutual friend, Hani. The air was light with the easy chatter of friends reuniting. The Vietnamese iced coffee, a tall glass of dark coffee sweetened with condensed milk, sat waiting for Myrna. She took a sip. Her face immediately contorted. "It's awful, it's bad," she complained, waving her hand in front of her mouth as if to bat away the foul taste. She urged Hani to try it, but Hani, after a tiny sip, recoiled from the acrid, burning sensation. Within moments, the scene devolved into chaos and horror. Myrna began to gasp for air, her body seizing in violent convulsions. Her head rolled back, her mouth foamed, and her eyes, wide with a terror she could no longer articulate, stared blankly into the distance. The chic ambience of the Olivier Café was shattered by the raw, primal reality of a young woman dying. Myrna's husband, Arif, was called, and he rushed her to the Abdi Waluyo hospital. But it was too late. At 6:30 p.m., Wayan Myrna Salahin was pronounced dead, her life extinguished in the space between one sip of coffee and the next. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath, Jessica Wongso was a picture of eerie composure. While others panicked, she remained strangely still, a calm island in a storm of grief and confusion. This unsettling detachment would become one of the first and most enduring red flags for investigators. As Myrna's father, Eddie Darmoin Salahin, would later testify, Jessica's behavior was not that of a grieving friend, but of someone watching a plan unfold. The police investigation began immediately, and the initial findings were chilling. An autopsy conducted on January 10th revealed bleeding in Myrna's stomach. Toxicology reports confirmed the unthinkable. Her system was flooded with cyanide, a poison so potent that a minuscule amount can kill within minutes. The Vietnamese iced coffee she had drunk was found to contain a lethal dose. This was not an accident. It was a meticulously planned and flawlessly executed murder. The focus of the investigation quickly narrowed to the one person who had control over the coffee, the one person who had arrived an hour early and built a fortress of shopping bags around the murder weapon. On January 30th, 2016, Jessica Kamala Wongso was arrested and charged with the premeditated murder of her friend. The iced coffee murder, as it was quickly dubbed by the media, was about to become the most sensational and divisive criminal case in modern Indonesian history. As Indonesian investigators dug into Jessica's life, they reached out to their counterparts in Australia. The Australian Federal Police, AFP, handed over a confidential file that painted a disturbing picture of Jessica's life down under. It was not the story of a successful design student, but of a woman teetering on the edge. The file detailed a tumultuous relationship with an Australian boyfriend, Patrick O'Connor, a relationship so volatile that it had resulted in a restraining order against her. It spoke of her struggles with mental health, including episodes of suicidal ideation and a bizarre incident where she crashed her car into a nursing home. It revealed a pattern of manipulation and a simmering rage that lurked just beneath her calm, collected surface. A former colleague, Christy Louise Charter, would later testify that Jessica had 2 starkly different personalities and was adept at manipulating people to gain sympathy, becoming enraged when she didn't get the attention she craved. The prosecution's theory of motive began to crystallize. It was a story of jealousy and revenge. They alleged that Myrna, during a visit to Australia, had advised Jessica to break up with the troubled Patrick O'Connor. This advice, meant as a gesture of friendship, had been interpreted by Jessica as a deep and unforgivable betrayal. In the prosecution's narrative, Myrna's happy, settled life, her new marriage, her loving family, was a constant, painful reminder of Jessica's own failures. The murder, they would argue, was an act of bitter retribution, a desire to destroy the happiness she could not have. The trial of Jessica Wongso began on June 15, 2016, and it was unlike anything Indonesia had ever seen. The proceedings were broadcast live on national television, transforming a complex legal battle into a national spectacle. For nearly 5 months, the country was held captive by the real-life courtroom drama. Millions tuned in daily, dissecting every piece of evidence, every expert opinion, every tearful testimony. The trial became a cultural phenomenon, its ratings eclipsing those of the popular soap operas or Sintrons it replaced. The public was divided, with passionate arguments for both Jessica's guilt and her innocence erupting in cafes, offices, and online forums across the archipelago. The prosecution, led by a team of determined public prosecutors, built their case on a powerful, if circumstantial, chain of evidence. They had the CCTV footage showing Jessica's strange behavior, her early arrival, the ordering of the drinks, and the crucial moment she erected the wall of shopping bags. They argued that this was not the behavior of an innocent person, but the calculated actions of a killer concealing her crime. This deed was vile and sadistic, committed against her own friend, the chief judge would later conclude, echoing the prosecution's sentiment. The defense, led by the formidable lawyer Otto Hasibuan, fought back with equal ferocity. Their central argument was simple and powerful. There was no direct evidence. No one saw Jessica put cyanide into the coffee. The case, they argued, was built on speculation, misinterpretation, and a rush to judgment fueled by a media frenzy. They brought in their own team of experts, including a respected Australian forensic pathologist, Bung Bung Ong, who sensationally testified that the amount of cyanide found in Myrna's stomach, 0.2 milligrams per liter, discovered days after her death, was negligible and far below a lethal dose. He argued that Myrna could have died from natural causes, a theory that sent shockwaves through the trial. The prosecution, in turn, attacked Ong's credibility, and he was later deported for not having the proper work visa, a move the defense saw as a blatant attempt to silence a dissenting voice. The trial became a battle of experts, a dizzying back and forth of conflicting scientific opinions. Toxicologists for the prosecution insisted that the low level of cyanide was due to the time that had passed before the sample was taken, and that the symptoms Myrna displayed were classic signs of cyanide poisoning. Defense experts countered that a lethal dose of cyanide would have produced a strong, unmistakable almond-like odor that would have filled the cafe, an odor that no one had reported. The courtroom was also a theater of high emotion. Myrna's father, Eddie Darmawan Salihin, was a constant, looming presence, his grief and rage palpable. He gave impassioned interviews to the media, at one point calling Jessica a crazy psychonarcissist, and became a driving force in the public narrative of her guilt. Myrna's twin sister, Sandy, testified that Jessica had sent her strange messages after Myrna's death, sending her links to news articles about poison, an act the family found deeply suspicious. Through it all, Jessica remained a figure of confounding composure. She rarely showed emotion, her face a blank canvas onto which a divided nation projected its own theories of guilt and innocence. The prosecution portrayed her calm as the cold, calculative demeanor of a psychopath. Her defense argued it was the reaction of a woman in shock, wrongly accused of a horrific crime. In her own diary, she wrote that the theories against her were illogical. When she finally spoke, her defense of her actions was disarmingly simple. "The shopping bags? Oh, it's just me being me," she said. "I just put it there, shuffle it, and play with it. It really doesn't mean anything at all, just me being bored." On October 27, 2016, after a marathon 135-day trial, the moment of judgment arrived. The panel of 3 judges found Jessica Kamala Wongso guilty of the premeditated murder of Wayan Myrna Salihin. They sentenced her to 20 years in prison. The verdict was read out in a packed courtroom, broadcast live to a nation holding its breath. Jessica's appeals to the Jakarta High Court and later to the Supreme Court were both rejected, solidifying her fate. But the legal conviction did little to settle the public debate. The case, with its lack of a smoking gun and its reliance on circumstantial evidence and conflicting expert testimony, remained a source of intense controversy. The release of the 2023 Netflix documentary, Ice Cold: Murder, Coffee and Jessica Wongso, reignited the debate, presenting the story to a global audience and raising serious questions about the fairness of the trial and the reliability of the evidence. The film highlighted the immense public pressure, the potential for bias, and the arguments of legal experts who believed the prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. On August 18, 2024, after serving approximately 8 years of her sentence, Jessica Wongso was released on parole. She emerged from prison a celebrity of sorts, a figure of enduring fascination and notoriety. At a press conference following her release, she maintained her innocence, though she pointedly avoided directly answering whether she was responsible for Myrna's death. "I have forgiven everyone who wronged me," she stated, her words carrying a carefully crafted ambiguity. The story of Jessica Wongso and the iced coffee murder is a tragedy that refuses to rest. It is a story of a young life cut short, of a friendship that curdled into a deadly poison, and of a legal battle that became a national obsession. It leaves behind a trail of unanswered questions and a family forever shattered by a loss that can never be measured. For Myrna Salahin's loved ones, the conviction of her killer brought a measure of justice, but not peace. The why of it all remains a dark, impenetrable mystery, a secret locked away behind the calm, enigmatic smile of the woman who shared a final, fatal cup of coffee with her friend. Story 4. The dog appeared first, trotting into the dusty lanes of Sheamoya just after dawn, carrying something in its jaws that no one wanted to look at too closely. It was Sunday, September 9th, 2007, and the township on the KwaZulu-Natal south coast was waking slowly, the smell of wood smoke and boiling malai meal drifting between tin-roofed homes. A child spotted the dog first and screamed. What the animal had dragged from the nearby sugarcane fields was the decomposing head of a woman. Word moves fast in a small community, and within the hour a crowd had gathered, drawn by horror and disbelief in equal measure. Someone followed the dog's tracks back toward the cane fields that bordered the township, the same fields where local children played hide and seek after school, and where many of Sheamoya's adults earned their wages cutting stalks under the South African sun. There, half hidden among the green stems, they found the rest of the body. Before the day was finished, a second body had been discovered nearby. The community that had once seen the sugarcane plantation as a source of livelihood and childhood memory was about to learn that it had become something else entirely, a graveyard. In the days that followed, the earth kept giving up its dead. Cane workers, doing the ordinary labor of harvest, kept stumbling upon what no one should ever have to find: badly decomposed remains, skeletal fragments wrapped in scraps of clothing, body after body, some lying just 15 meters from one another, as though the person responsible had returned again and again to the same patch of earth, confident that the tall green stalks would keep his secret. The Port Shepstone Organized Crime Unit was called in, and soon a full task team had been assembled, drawing on the resources of the provincial police office. 30 officers moved through the plantation in grim, methodical lines, sniffer dogs straining at their leads. Forensic experts flew in from Pretoria, hundreds of kilometers away, to assist with the grisly work of examining what the cane fields had concealed. At first, investigators were reluctant to say aloud what everyone was beginning to suspect. But as the bodies accumulated, even in total from the Sheamoya fields alone, denial became impossible. A serial killer was operating in KwaZulu-Natal, and he did not appear to be finished. Slowly, painstakingly, detectives began to build a profile of the dead. All of the victims were young women, between 18 and 25 years old. All of them, it emerged, had vanished while searching for work. Some had been strangled. Many bodies bore signs that they had been burned after death, an attempt, investigators believed, to erase whatever evidence might remain, and to hide identity for as long as possible. But the killer had made mistakes. Scattered near the remains, weathered by exposure but not destroyed, investigators found identity documents, welfare cards, and curricula vitae, the very papers these young women would have carried while hunting for employment. The bodies themselves were often too decomposed for visual identification, but these small paper fragments became the thread that connected the dead to the living, to families who had already filed missing persons reports and who had been waiting, in that particular agony of not knowing, for months. When detectives began interviewing the grieving families, a pattern emerged that chilled them further. Each family described the same final memory: a daughter, a sister, a niece, telling them she had been offered a job, and that she was going to meet the man who would take her to it. Full of hope, dressed in her best clothes, she had climbed aboard a minibus taxi and vanished from the world. The breakthrough came from an unlikely witness, a woman who had very nearly become one of the victims herself. She told detectives that she had once sat beside a man on a taxi bound for Sheamoya, a man who introduced himself as a recruiter with promising job connections at well-known companies in the area. Something about the situation had unsettled her, and at the last possible moment, she chose not to accompany him further. That decision saved her life, and it gave police their first physical description of a suspect, an identikit sketch built from her memory of his face. Investigators also discovered the method behind the madness. Before killing the women, the man robbed them, stripping them of clothing, cash, and cell phones. It was a detail that spoke to greed layered atop cruelty, but it was also, unknowingly, the killer's fatal error. Cell phones leave trails. Networks record which towers a handset pings, who calls whom, and where a phone travels after it changes hands. Cell phone forensic analysts traced one of the stolen handsets through the network and found it had ended up in the possession of a woman living in Stanger, on the KwaZulu-Natal north coast. When detectives approached her, she gave them a name and, more importantly, a location: her brother-in-law, a man named Thozamile Taki. At 2 o'clock in the morning on September 24th, 2007, a heavily armed police unit moved through the narrow, close-packed lanes of low-cost housing in Welbedacht, Chatsworth. They found the address, broke through the door, and inside discovered a man and a woman living together. The man was Thozamile Taki, 36 years old. The woman was his girlfriend, Lenja Nene. Scattered through the home, police found cell phones and clothing that belonged, unmistakably, to some of the murdered women. Taki was arrested that night. Nene was taken into custody as well, charged as an accessory after the fact. 3 other individuals were briefly arrested in connection with the case, but were later released as the true shape of the crimes became clear. What makes this moment in the story almost unbearable is what happened next. Even with Taki behind bars, the search of the sugarcane fields continued, and the body count kept rising. By his second court appearance in October 2007, the number of confirmed victims had grown to 8. By mid-November, police had recovered 11 bodies from the fields around Sheamoya alone. 2 more victims, found far away in the tea plantations near Port St. John's in the Eastern Cape, were eventually linked to the same man, bringing the final total to 13 young women, murdered over a matter of months in early 2007. Behind every statistic in this case was a girl or young woman with a name, a family, and a future she believed was just within reach. Makosi Mgabhozi of Effelwini, Noxalom Pand of Bizana, Nosisa Nozoso of Libode, Charity Mthethwa of Tongat, Rose Mjoli of Bizana, Kanayasile Nkayana of Bizana, Thandika Mthebani of Matataila, Nanjabulom Panza of Effelwini, Philisile Mpanza of Effelwini, Nambali Onkobo of Yumzinyathi, Thandazile Bakota of Lusakisiki, Sizui Chonge of Lusakisiki, Charity Kumalo of Kwamashu. Each of them had answered, in her own way, the same desperate call that echoes across South Africa's difficult labor market. The promise of a job, a wage, a chance to lift herself and often her family out of poverty. Some had even borrowed money from relatives so they could afford new clothes, transport, or the small bribes Taki claimed were needed to secure their positions. They believed they were investing in their futures. Instead, they were paying for their own deaths. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors were able to piece together, testimony by testimony, exactly how Thozamile Taki operated. He posed as an employment agent, claiming connections to real, recognizable companies such as Hewlett's, Nestle, Alovo, Sazila, and Toyota, most of which he said had openings in the Umzinto area of KwaZulu-Natal. It was a believable lie, precisely because those companies did operate in the region, and precisely because unemployment pressed so heavily on so many young people desperate enough to trust a stranger's promise. Once he had earned a victim's trust, he lured her onto a minibus taxi bound for Umzinto, and in a chilling detail that surfaced during testimony, he often had the women pay his own taxi fare, framing it as a natural part of securing the job he claimed to be offering. They were, without knowing it, funding the very journey that would end their lives. Upon arrival, Taki would separate his victims if he had lured more than one at a time, dealing with each in turn rather than risk complications. He asked for money, sums ranging from roughly 300 to 3,000 rand, framing the payments as rent deposits at their new jobs or bribes required to lock in the positions. Then, in the sugarcane fields of Umzinto, or the tea plantations of Kwamajola near Port St. John's, he robbed them of what little else they carried, and killed them, most likely by strangulation, though the advanced decomposition of many bodies made it impossible for pathologists to determine an exact cause of death in every case. Investigators did find evidence of ligatures around wrists and necks on several remains, wire and rope pressed into fragile evidence of final, terrified moments. One woman, Dudun Tetha, survived an encounter with Taki that claimed the life of her travel companion, Nambali Kobo. Her testimony, delivered years later in a courtroom hundreds of kilometers from where it happened, became one of the case's most haunting threads, a living voice describing how narrowly death had been avoided, and how it had claimed someone standing right beside her. The scale of the case demanded an extraordinary trial. Proceedings began in 2008 in the High Court sitting at Ramsgate, and would not conclude until January 2011 in the Durban High Court, where the matter was moved for its final judgment and sentencing. Over the course of the trial, 103 witnesses were called to testify, their words carefully translated from isiXhosa to isiZulu, and then into English, so the record could be understood by everyone in the courtroom. Advocate Noxolo Tukwana led the prosecution, and argued forcefully that Taki had deliberately exploited South Africa's high unemployment rate, using the very real desperation of young job seekers as a weapon against them. She pointed to his complete absence of remorse throughout the proceedings, noting that he had, on more than one occasion, smiled while grieving family members wept on the witness stand. Taki was charged with 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of robbery with aggravating circumstances, 26 charges in total. Though investigators suspected the victims may have been sexually assaulted, the state was unable to prove this due to the extent of decomposition of the remains. A small mercy, perhaps, that spared families one further horror they could not have confirmed regardless. On December 23, 2010, after years of testimony and forensic argument, Judge King Ndlovu delivered his verdict. Taki was found guilty on all 26 counts. His girlfriend, Hlenjanene, charged as an accessory, was acquitted entirely. The judge described her as a victim of circumstance rather than a participant in the killings. The sentencing hearing, held on January 19, 2011, gave South Africa its final, indelible portrait of the man behind the killings. Judge Ndlovu reviewed Taki's background. 39 years old, the eldest of 4 children, a father who had abandoned the family when Taki was 19, a mother who had raised her children alone until her own death. Taki had left school at what the record calls Standard 2, an early grade, though the judge noted dryly that Taki's behavior in court, taking careful notes, quietly instructing his own defense counsel during cross-examination, suggested a mind considerably sharper than his limited formal education implied. None of this history, the judge concluded, amounted to circumstances substantial enough to soften the punishment that the law demanded. Taki had two young children of his own, aged around 6 and 4, born to a former partner named Vuziwi Denaiso, who had herself testified for the prosecution. She told the court that Taki had stopped supporting his children after she discovered him with another woman in Chatsworth sometime before June 2007. Judge Ndlovu weighed the mitigating factor of the 39 months Taki had already spent in custody awaiting trial against the sheer scale of what he had done, and found the balance overwhelmingly in favor of severity. He noted Taki's prior convictions, a 1997 sentence for housebreaking and theft, a 1999 sentence for robbery, proof that this was not a man new to crime, merely a man whose crimes had escalated to an almost unimaginable degree. Then came the judge's most memorable words, delivered in a courtroom that had, by then, absorbed years of grief. He called Taki a jackal in sheep's clothing, a man who had presented himself to his victims as charming, kind, and trustworthy, while in reality stalking them with the patience and coldness of a predator. Ndlovu told the court he had personally watched Taki's demeanor throughout the trial, watched him smile as witnesses broke down in tears, and found in that behavior nothing but confirmation of a man beyond rehabilitation. The sentence, when it came, was almost without precedent. 13 life sentences, one for each murdered woman, plus 208 years, calculated at 16 years for each of the 13 robbery convictions. The sentences were ordered to run concurrently, meaning that in practical terms Taki would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. Judge Ndlovu went further still, explicitly urging South Africa's Department of Correctional Services never to consider Taki for parole, stating plainly that his release would pose a permanent danger to any woman he might encounter. Outside the Durban High Court that day, a crowd that had gathered to hear the verdict erupted, not in violence, but in something closer to collective relief, a release of tension that had built across more than 3 years of investigation, trial, and testimony. Today, close to where the first decomposing remains were discovered near Sheamoya Township, a memorial plaque stands among the very cane fields that once concealed 13 bodies. It bears the names of the women who never returned from their search for work, a quiet, permanent reminder in a landscape that had briefly become one of South Africa's most notorious crime scenes. The case of Thosamile Taki remains one of the most extensively documented serial murder investigations in modern South African history, not simply for the number of victims, but for what it revealed about vulnerability, desperation, and the terrible ease with which a predator could exploit both. It stands as a somber testament to the 13 women whose hope for a better life led them, one by one, into a sugarcane field from which they never walked out. Story 5. On a warm January evening in 2018, in a quiet suburban house in Durban North, a 20-year-old woman named Siam Lee vanished. Within days, her charred remains would be discovered in a distant field, and her name would become one of the most talked about, misunderstood, and ultimately unresolved cases in recent South African criminal history. What began as a missing persons report would spiral into a story of exploitation, brutality, and a justice system that, in the end, could not deliver the reckoning her family so desperately needed. Durban North is, on the surface, an unremarkable slice of suburban South Africa, lined with palm trees, walled gardens, and the quiet hum of ordinary domestic life. But behind the door of one particular house on that January night, the ordinary gave way to something far darker. The property was operating as a brothel, a place where young women, including Siam, worked as escorts. Siam herself was only 20 years old, though some later reports would describe her as 21 by the time the case reached its final, unresolved conclusion. The full picture of how Siam came to be in that house is one of the most painful threads of her story. That her own mother, Nan Lee, known to some as Carmen, had played a role in introducing her daughter to this work. This detail, when it surfaced publicly, overwhelmed much of the early media coverage, turning a missing young woman into tabloid fodder before the facts of her disappearance and death had even been properly understood. It is a detail that speaks to something larger and sadder than any single crime. A young woman who may never have had the protections a mother is supposed to provide, placed instead into an environment of vulnerability that a predator would soon exploit. On the night Siam disappeared, she had been seen leaving the house in a Mercedes-Benz Vito, a detail that would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence police pursued. For 2 agonizing days, nobody could account for where she had gone. Somewhere in the city, a young woman was fighting for her life, and somewhere else, in a mortuary far from anyone who might recognize her, an unidentified body lay waiting for someone to connect the pieces. That is perhaps the cruelest detail in the entire case. While her family and friends searched, while police tried to trace her movements, Siam's body had already been found, burned beyond recognition in a field near New Hanover, a rural area in the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands, far from the Durban North house where she was last seen alive. The distance between where she disappeared and where she was found speaks to the deliberate, calculated nature of what had happened to her. Someone had taken her a long way from the city, to a place where a body could be hidden and destroyed without immediate detection, and it took days before investigators realized that the unidentified remains in the mortuary and the missing young woman everyone was searching for were one and the same person. When the truth was finally established, it broke over her family and the wider public with the force of a confirmed nightmare. Siam Lee had not run away. She had not simply gone quiet for a few days as young adults sometimes do. She had been abducted, and she had been killed, and whoever had done this had tried to erase her identity along with her life. The investigation moved with unusual speed for a South African murder case. Within roughly a week of Siam going missing, police announced a breakthrough. They recovered the Mercedes-Benz Vito believed to be the same vehicle she was seen leaving in Durban North, and they arrested a suspect. The man's name was Philanine Tully, a 29-year-old described in early reporting as a businessman. For Siam's family, and for a South African public that had been following the case with mounting horror, the arrest offered something rare in cases like this: the possibility that answers and eventually justice might actually come. Tully was formally charged, and the charges reflected an escalating picture of violence that stretched well beyond a single crime. He faced counts including murder, kidnapping, rape, intimidation, and crime and injuria, ultimately totaling 16 separate charges. Investigators and a private investigator who worked closely on the case, a man named Brad Nathanson, would later allege that Ntully's pattern of violence extended even further, connecting him to the alleged assault of a masseuse in 2016 and to messages from numerous other women, many of them escorts, who came forward after his arrest to describe their own encounters with him. It is worth pausing here to understand what made this case so different from a simple story of one victim and one perpetrator. As the investigation deepened, it began to look less like an isolated act of violence and more like the exposure of a man who had been preying on vulnerable women, particularly those in escort work, for years largely without consequence, until his crimes against Siam Lee finally drew the kind of scrutiny that could no longer be ignored. While the legal case against Ntully slowly made its way through South Africa's court system over the following months, it was easy for the details of process, hearings, and postponements to overshadow the person at the center of it all. Siam Lee was 20 years old. She had a life before the headlines, a mother, friends, and an identity that the public discourse around her case often reduced to a single word: sex worker. Journalists who later revisited her story explicitly pushed back against this flattening, describing efforts to understand who Siam really was outside the one-dimensional character that had been constructed around her in the public imagination. This tension, between Siam as a tabloid headline and Siam as a real young woman who was loved and is missed, runs through the entire case like a fault line. Her mother, Nan Lee, whatever her own complicated and painful role in her daughter's life, showed up for her in the end. Court records and news reports describe her traveling by bus to Durban to attend hearings, sitting through legal proceedings that dealt with the mechanics of her daughter's death in clinical, procedural language, a mother forced to relive her child's murder through the cold vocabulary of the courtroom. For a year and a half, the case crept toward what should have been its reckoning, a full murder trial where evidence could be tested, witnesses could be heard, and a verdict could finally be reached. That trial was scheduled to begin in mid-2019. It never happened. In the final weeks before proceedings were set to start, word began to spread that Philanine Tully had died. Reports indicated he had been diagnosed with skin cancer and had been undergoing treatment while out on bail of 40,000 rand. He reportedly died on June 21, 2019, and was buried in Sabantu, Pietermaritzburg. The uncertainty that followed his reported death added an unsettling new chapter to an already devastating case. For days, police were unable to conclusively confirm whether Ntuli was truly dead or alive, a delay that only deepened the anguish of a family who had already waited so long for resolution. When the matter finally returned to the Durban High Court on July 2, 2019, prosecutors presented a death certificate. State Advocate Cheryl Naidu explained that it had taken time for the state to obtain confirmation, noting that word of Ntuli's death had first reached them through press reports rather than official channels, and that fingerprints had ultimately been taken from his body at the funeral parlor to confirm his identity. Judge Naresh Bika, presiding over the hearing, formally struck the case from the court roll, describing the outcome as a lost opportunity after so much investigative work had gone into building the case against him. For Nan Lee, who had made the long journey to Durban specifically to witness this moment, the news landed with a bitterness that few could fully imagine. In comments captured by reporters at the time, she expressed a raw and unfiltered grief, saying she wished he had died a violent death rather than succumbing quietly to illness while out on bail. A sentiment born not of cruelty, but of a mother's shattered hope that her daughter's killer would ever truly face the consequences of what he had done. If the story had ended there, it would already stand as a tragedy. A young woman murdered, a suspect identified, and a case closed not by verdict but by death before trial. But the ambiguity surrounding Tuli's death refused to settle, and in the years that followed, doubt crept back into a case that already carried more than its share of unanswered questions. The catalyst arrived in 2023, when a very different but eerily similar story broke into South African headlines. The escape of convicted murderer and rapist Thabo Bester from the Mangang Correctional Center, a man who had staged his own death by fire inside his prison cell, only to be discovered alive and 3 months later, after DNA testing revealed that the burned remains found in his cell belonged to someone else entirely. The revelation sent a shockwave through the country, and it also sent something else rippling specifically through the Siam Lee case, renewed suspicion. Brad Nathanson, the private investigator who had worked closely on Siam's case and had come to know the details of Ntuli's alleged crimes intimately, revealed that his office had been flooded with messages from members of the public, all asking the same haunting question. Was Philanine Ntuli really dead? Nathanson was candid in his response, acknowledging that he had never personally seen Ntuli's body, and that everything he knew about the death came from what he had been told rather than what he had directly witnessed. He drew a stark comparison between the two men, suggesting that if Thabo Bester deserved to be called a monster for his crimes, then Ntuli, given what Nathanson knew of the allegations against him, made Bester look tame by comparison. It was a chilling assessment, delivered by someone with unusually close knowledge of the case, and it left the public, and presumably Siam's family, with a question that may never be fully answered with certainty. Was justice denied by death or evaded by deception? To date, no court verdict has ever formally established guilt in Siam Lee's murder, and the man accused of killing her died, at least officially, before he could be tried. There has been no trial, no cross-examination of evidence, no formal legal reckoning, only a death certificate, a set of fingerprints taken at a funeral parlor, and a court order striking the case from the roll. A story defined as much by what is unresolved as by what is known. A young woman was taken from a house in Durban North and killed in a distant sugarcane field. Her body burned in an apparent attempt to prevent identification, and the man accused of doing this to her escaped the reach of a courtroom through the ordinary, undramatic fact of death, or perhaps, as some continue to wonder, through something far less ordinary. Her mother's grief, raw and public, and the tireless work of investigators who continued to press for clarity long after the legal system had closed its file, stand as the closest thing to accountability this case has ever produced. Siam Lee deserved better than to become a headline reduced to a single label, and she deserved a trial that could have tested the evidence against the man accused of ending her life. Neither of those things fully came to pass. What is left is a name, a memory kept alive by journalists and investigators unwilling to let the case fade quietly into unresolved history, and a question that continues to linger over the sugarcane fields where her story ended. Whether the truth of what happened to her, and to the man accused of killing her, has ever really been laid to rest. Story 6. The town of Wellington in Shropshire, England, rests as a quiet market hub, a place where life flows with a familiar, comforting rhythm. In the spring of 2013, it was a town like any other, its streets lined with a mix of old brick and new facades, its people going about their days with the easy assurance that tragedy was something that happened elsewhere, to other people. For the Williams family, this sense of security was woven into the very fabric of their lives. Steve Williams was a detective constable with the local West Mercia police, a man who dealt with the darker side of human nature as a profession, but who came home to a world of warmth and love. His youngest daughter, Georgia, was the heart of that world. At 17, Georgia Williams was a spark of life. A former head girl at a Colwood Technology College, she possessed a spirit that was both kind and fiercely ambitious. Friends knew her affectionately as Ferret, a nickname that captured her playful energy. She was small in stature, just 5 feet 3 inches, but her dreams were vast. Initially, she had set her sights on joining the Royal Air Force, but upon discovering women were not eligible for her desired regiment, she pivoted with characteristic resolve, planning to train as a paramedic instead. She was, by all accounts, a generous and caring young woman, the kind of person who radiated a goodness that seemed to promise a long and happy future. But in the digital shadows of this ordinary town, a very different future was being meticulously planned. Jamie Reynolds, a 22-year-old who lived nearby, was a name Georgia knew, but not a person she knew well. To most, he was an unremarkable shop worker. Online, and in the privacy of his own mind, he was curating a gallery of horrors. Reynolds was nursing what a court would later describe as a morbid fascination with extreme violence. His computer hard drive was a vault of depravity, containing 16,800 images and 72 videos depicting violence against women. His obsession was not just passive, it was creative. He downloaded pictures of girls he knew, some of them friends of George's sister, Scarlett, and used digital software to add ropes around their necks, transforming their innocent portraits into grotesque simulations of his fantasies. This darkness had breached the surface before. 5 years earlier, in 2008, Reynolds had tried to strangle a 16-year-old girl during a struggle at his home. The girl escaped, but the subsequent investigation was a study in failure. West Mercia Police, the same force where George's father worked, treated the attack as a minor assault. No photographs were taken of the victim's injuries, no forensic medical examiner was consulted, and the incident was closed with a simple warning. Reynolds was allowed to return to college, where he continued to intimidate his victim. The authorities had been given a chilling preview of his capabilities, a clear warning of the predator in their midst. But the warning went unheeded. The system designed to protect had looked away, and in doing so, had left the door open for a tragedy that was not just foreseeable, but preventable. On the evening of Sunday, May 26, 2013, the Williams family life was about to shatter. At around 7:30 p.m., Georgia told her parents she was going out. Jamie Reynolds had invited her to his parents' house on Avondale Road, just a short distance away, with a plausible and innocent-sounding request. He needed a model for a photography project. Georgia, who had previously helped her sister with similar shoots for her business, agreed to help. She had made it clear to Reynolds on social media and to her friends that she had no romantic interest in him. This was simply a favor. She left home, a daughter telling her family she would see them later, and walked into a meticulously laid trap. The last texts from her phone were sent at 8 p.m. In the quiet of his parents' house, Reynolds executed his long-nurtured fantasy. Investigators would later conclude that Georgia was killed sometime between 8 o'clock and 9 p.m. that night. He had prepared a length of rope, attached it to the loft hatch, and hanged the trusting teenager who had come to his home to help him. It was an act of ultimate betrayal, committed not in a fit of rage, but to fulfill a cold, sadistic desire. As the judge would later state, Reynolds watched her die, and the act of watching was a central part of his pleasure. Afterwards, he desecrated her body, taking photographs to commemorate his horrific achievement before preparing for the next stage of his plan. The next day, May 27th, while the Williams family began to feel the first stirrings of unease, Reynolds was on the move. He loaded George's body into his father's silver Toyota Hiace van and began a long, meandering journey north. He drove through Oswestry, Rill, Chester, and Kendall, a ghost moving through the mundane traffic of a bank holiday Monday. At one point, he casually stopped at a cinema in Wrexham before continuing on his way to Glasgow. By May 28th, the unease in the Williams household had bloomed into full-blown panic. Georgia had not returned. She was not answering her phone. Her family reported her missing. Her father's colleagues at West Mercia Police launched an investigation. The initial appeals were tinged with a desperate hope, asking Georgia to come home, but they were quickly overshadowed by a more sinister reality. Police publicly stated that her disappearance was out of character and that they feared she may have come to harm. The manhunt for Jamie Reynolds intensified. On May 29th, acting on intelligence, police officers in Scotland converged on a budget hotel in Glasgow. There, in the car park, they found the missing Toyota van. Inside the hotel, they found Reynolds and arrested him on suspicion of kidnapping. The initial interview was chilling in its brevity. Confronted by officers desperate to find the missing girl, Reynolds was asked a single, urgent question. "Where is Georgia Williams?" His reply was a cold, flat denial. "I don't know." He was immediately rearrested on suspicion of murder and prepared for the long journey back to Telford to face the detectives from his hometown. In the pre-dawn darkness of that same Wednesday, 2 senior police officers knocked on the door of the Williams family home. For Steve and Lynette Williams, the sight of high-ranking officers at their door at 5:30 a.m. confirmed their worst fears. As Lynette would later recall, "That's when we both knew we wouldn't have high-ranking officers knocking on our door to tell us good news." The hope they had clung to for 3 agonizing days evaporated in an instant. Back in Telford, Reynolds was now the sole focus of the murder inquiry. Knowing that George's body had been moved, investigators released the details of Reynolds' route to Glasgow, appealing for anyone who had seen the silver van to come forward, hoping for a clue that would lead them to her. The search was now not for a missing person, but for a gravesite. On May 31st, the breakthrough came. Following a tip, search teams focused on a remote stretch of woodland off the Nant-Wygarth Pass, a winding, scenic road near Ruthin in North Wales, 55 miles from Wellington. There, hidden amongst the trees, they found a body. That same day, Jamie Reynolds was formally charged with the murder of Georgia Williams. On June 1st, a shattered Steve Williams stood before the press and paid tribute to his daughter, his voice thick with a grief that no parent should ever know, describing her simply as a great girl. 3 days later, on June 4th, dental records confirmed the devastating truth. The body found in the Welsh woods was George's. A post-mortem examination revealed she had died from pressure applied to the neck. On what was supposed to be the first day of his trial at Stafford Crown Court in December 2013, Jamie Reynolds, who had previously denied the charge, changed his plea to guilty. The courtroom was spared the trauma of a full trial, but the sentencing hearing that followed laid bare the full extent of his depravity. The prosecution detailed the trove of extreme pornography on his computer, the doctored images of other local girls, and the photographic evidence related to the moments before and after George's murder. He was labeled a sexual deviant and a man who, according to psychiatric reports, had the potential to become a serial killer. Mr. Justice Wilkie, delivering the sentence, looked at Reynolds and spoke of a crime of truly exceptional gravity. He sentenced Reynolds to a whole life term, one of the rarest and most severe punishments in the British legal system, ensuring he would never be released from prison. The judge's words captured the calculated cruelty of the crime. "You plotted your murder to give sadistic pleasure," he said. "You watched her die in circumstances where you could have saved her, and doing so was a central part of your pleasure. After the killing, you took sexual pleasure in her body, then treated her body with contempt, dumping her in a remote area." For George's family, the verdict brought no relief. "The pain we feel is as raw now as it was when our beautiful Georgia was taken from us," her father said in a statement. "Today's guilty plea gives us no satisfaction at all. We do not and will never understand the heartbreaking events of earlier this year that changed our lives forever." In the aftermath, the focus shifted to the string of failures that had allowed a known predator to kill. A serious case review, published in 2015, was a damning indictment of the authorities. It found significant shortfalls in the 2008 police investigation into Reynolds' first attack. The chief constable of West Mercia Police, David Shaw, made a public admission. "We could have and should have done better. We let Georgia down." The Williams family voiced the conclusion that the official report made unavoidable. They believed George's death could have been prevented if the agencies tasked with monitoring Reynolds had done their jobs properly. It was so obvious that Reynolds was, if not one already, a murderer in the making, they stated, their words a powerful accusation against a system that had failed to connect the dots. The case led to misconduct hearings for several officers involved in the flawed 2008 investigation, though the consequences were minimal. Reynolds later attempted to appeal his whole life sentence, but the Court of Appeal upheld the original judgment, stating there was no basis on which it can properly be argued that a whole life order was not required. The case of Georgia Williams is a story of profound and senseless loss. It is the story of a vibrant young woman on the cusp of her life, stolen away by a man whose violent fantasies were allowed to fester unchecked. But it is also a story of systemic failure, a chilling reminder that the most monstrous acts are often preceded by warnings that are missed, ignored, or mishandled. The quiet town of Wellington was irrevocably changed, its sense of safety shattered. For the Williams family, the pain is a life sentence of its own. Their daughter's memory endures not only as a beloved child, sister, and friend, but as a tragic symbol of the duty of care that was broken and the devastating cost of looking away. Story 7. The first day of December 2011 dawned over Deer Park, Washington, with the unassuming chill of the coming winter. The small town, a quiet cluster of homes and lives nestled north of Spokane, was a place where routines were a comfort and the rhythms of family life set the pace. For Shannon Starbuck, a 42-year-old mother of 5, the day was supposed to begin like any other. But a cold current was moving beneath the surface of her life, a tangle of new freedoms and old wounds that was about to pull her into darkness. Shannon and Clay Starbuck's love story was a fractured epic, written in 2 marriages and 2 divorces. They had 5 children together, a constellation of young lives that orbited the unsteady gravity of their parents' relationship. Even after their second and final divorce was finalized in July 2011, their lives remained inextricably linked by the daily logistics of co-parenting. Clay lived just half a mile away, a constant, familiar presence. He drove the children to school each morning, a small ritual that kept the frayed threads of their family from completely unraveling. In the wake of the divorce, Shannon was exploring a new, uncertain chapter. She was studying to become a dental assistant, seeking financial independence after years of turmoil. She was also navigating the bewildering world of online dating, a landscape of digital personas and fleeting connections. She maintained multiple email addresses, communicating with a string of men she met online. It was a life lived in compartments: the devoted mother, the aspiring professional, and the woman seeking companionship in the lonely spaces of the internet. This new life was a source of concern for her children, who were aware of the strangers their mother was meeting, and for Clay, who worried about the risks she was taking. The family home on North Riper Street, once the bedrock of their lives, now felt like a place with unsecured doors. The morning of Thursday, December 1st, began with a disruption to the routine. Shortly after 7 a.m., Clay started out in his old Toyota Tercel to pick up the children for school, but the car sputtered and died on the road. He walked back home, his plans thwarted. A flurry of text messages followed. At 7:54 a.m., he texted his daughter, "Log on. Is mom up? Car is acting up." A few minutes later, at 8:06 a.m., he messaged Shannon directly. "Car quit. Can you take the kids?" Her reply was a single terse letter: K. Shannon, now awake and tasked with the morning school run, took the children. As she did, her phone was already lighting up with messages from another world. At 8:06 a.m., a man named Tom Walker sent a text: "Good morning, sexy." Shannon was juggling at least two such relationships. Walker was a recent acquaintance of 3 weeks. The other was a spoken school teacher named John Kenline, who used the alias John Wilson, and had met Shannon on a dating website. He was married with children, a fact he concealed, and their encounters were furtive and sexual, always at her home when the children weren't there. He had arranged to meet her that very morning at 10:30, having taken the day off from work for the tryst. After dropping the children at school, Shannon returned to an empty house. The timeline of what happened next would become the central, fiercely debated mystery of the case. The state's theory would later be that Clay had used his car trouble as a ruse, that he had not walked home, but had instead gone to Shannon's house, broken in, and lain in wait for her to return. At 9:17 a.m., a call was placed from Shannon's Starbucks cell phone to 911. It lasted only 35 seconds. The operator heard nothing intelligible, no voice, no struggle, just open air and silence. When the operator called the number back, the call went straight to voicemail. It was a ghost call, a fleeting and cryptic signal from a house where something was about to go terribly wrong. Prosecutors would later argue this was Shannon's desperate, failed attempt to call for help as she was being attacked. The defense would argue there was no proof of who made the call or why, that it could have been a simple pocket dial. While this phantom call was being logged, the men from Shannon's online life continued their digital courtship, oblivious. Tom Walker and Shannon exchanged a series of increasingly texts. Meanwhile, John Kenline was beginning his journey to Deer Park for their 10:30 a.m. rendezvous. His alibi for the crucial window of the murder would be thin. He claimed to have dropped his kids at school, then stopped at a Starbucks at 9:45 a.m., and then a library before heading to her house. He estimated he arrived around 10:20 a.m. He knocked, but there was no answer. He walked around the house, tried the doorknob, and left. The rest of the day unfolded through a series of text messages sent from Shannon's phone, messages that created the illusion she was alive and well, but which would later be seen as a cold-blooded attempt by her killer to control the narrative and delay the discovery of her body. At 12:10 p.m., her phone sent a text to Tom Walker suggesting lunch at the Onion restaurant. At 12:37 p.m., a message went to John Kenline. "Eating, did you?" He replied that he had, and a series of texts followed, arranging to meet later that night, a meeting that would never happen. In the afternoon, the deception turned toward her own children. At 2:45 p.m., her daughter Loghan texted, asking who was picking her up from school. The reply from Shannon's phone came 20 minutes later. "Dad, I have a headache, stay there." The children were eventually picked up by their older brother and taken to Clay's house. Clay, for his part, had gone back to bed after his car broke down. He woke up later, ate lunch, and eventually got the car started in the afternoon. Believing Shannon was supposed to pick up the children, he was surprised when they showed up at his house. At 3:28 p.m., he texted Shannon to let her know. He received no reply. Later that evening, he took the younger kids to their brother's basketball game. He texted Shannon again, inviting her to come, then chiding her for her absence. You should be involved in your child's activities. After the game, he took the kids to her house to drop them off. The doors were locked, the house was dark, and there was no answer. They returned to Clay's for the night. The silence from Shannon stretched into the next day, Friday, December 2nd. The younger children missed school because they didn't have fresh clothes. Concern began to mount. Shannon's mother, who lived in Florida, called the police and requested a welfare check. That evening, 2 deputies went to the house. They checked the doors and windows, saw a package on the porch, and finding no signs of foul play, they left after 10 minutes. They proceeded to Clay's house, where he showed them the text messages on his phone and told them about Shannon's online dating, urging them to look at her computer. His concern was palpable. He even called the deputy back late that night to see if they had found her. On Saturday, December 3rd, another friend, unable to reach Shannon, called for a second welfare check. This time, police had the landlord unlock the front door. At 9:11 a.m., almost 48 hours after the silent 911 call, they stepped inside, and the illusion that Shannon Starbuck was simply unavailable was shattered forever. They found her in her bedroom. She was lying on her bed, her body cold and still. It was immediately clear this was no natural death. She had been brutally beaten and strangled. But the scene was more than just a murder. It was a grotesque and deliberate tableau. Her body had been posed in a degrading manner, a final, horrific act of humiliation. The medical examiner would later confirm that she had been moved after her death, a difficult task given her weight, and that she died from compression to the neck. The time of death was uncertain, estimated to be sometime on Thursday, December 1st, or early on Friday, December 2nd. The house became a swarm of forensic specialists and detectives. They photographed, swabbed, and collected every potential piece of evidence. And from the moment they began, a powerful narrative started to form. Detective Mark Renz spoke with Clay Starbuck outside the house that morning. When Clay, in his shock and grief, immediately told the detective about his ex-wife's risky lifestyle and online encounters, the detective didn't see a grieving man trying to help. He saw a suspect trying to misdirect the investigation. My perception was he was probing me for information, Renz later stated. I think he was trying to lead us in a different direction. That seed of suspicion, planted within hours of the discovery, took root and grew, shaping the entire course of the investigation. The police had their man. The investigation that followed was, according to Clay's defense team, a case study in tunnel vision. Convinced of Clay's guilt, they viewed every piece of information through that lens. When Clay voluntarily came to the station for interviews, gave them his phone, and provided a DNA sample, they saw it as the actions of a calculating killer. They took photographs of his hands, looking for injuries from a struggle. They found none. The forensic evidence from the crime scene told a far more complicated story. DNA was found, but it didn't point a clear finger at Clay. In fact, it pointed in multiple other directions. DNA from 3 unidentified males was found on Shannon's body. One sample was from her paravaginal area, another from her ankle, which was never tested by police, and a third from her fingernail clippings. Furthermore, DNA from a male member of the Starbuck family, which could have been Clay or his 2 eldest sons, was found near her neck. The defense argued this was meaningless, as they had all lived in the house. Crucially, a wealth of other potential evidence, including 19 hairs found on her body and nightgown, a stained mattress pad and towels, was collected but never sent to the crime lab for testing. The other men in Shannon's life were interviewed, but not with the same intense scrutiny applied to Clay. Tom Walker's alibi for the morning of the murder was not airtight. John Kenline, the married teacher, had taken the day off work, gone to her house, and in a bizarre twist, was found to have purchased a cleaning product, Drain Pro Gel, at a Walmart late on the night of December 1st. He had also been evasive with police, only agreeing to an interview after they threatened to expose his affair. Both men were quickly excluded as suspects. For 2 months, the investigation continued while Clay and his children tried to navigate their shattered world. Then, on February 9, 2012, Clay Starbuck was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The state's case, presented at his trial in 2013, was built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence and motive. The prosecution painted a picture of a jealous, obsessive ex-husband, angered by Channon's lifestyle and motivated by greed over a $9,600 child support debt. They argued he faked his car trouble, ambushed Channon, murdered her, posed her body to humiliate her, and then meticulously used her phone to send messages to her lovers and children, creating an alibi for himself and making it seem as if she were still alive. The trial was a wrenching ordeal. The prosecution's narrative was powerful, and the judge made a series of crucial rulings that crippled the defense. The court largely prohibited Clay's lawyers from presenting their other suspect evidence, arguing there was no direct link between Walker, Kenline, or any other man to the homicide. The defense was barred from fully exploring the explicit text messages between Channon and Walker, messages which they argued were relevant because they mentioned the toy found at the crime scene. They were also restricted in their attempts to show the jury what they saw as a biased and incompetent police investigation that had ignored crucial leads from the very beginning. The most powerful testimony in Clay's defense came from his own children. One by one, they took the stand and spoke of a father they knew to be incapable of such a crime. They painted a picture of parents who were co-parenting effectively, despite their history. Things were twisted, their son Blake said years later. We were there. We lived with my mom. We lived with my dad. We knew what kind of people they were. Their unwavering support stood in stark contrast to the prosecution's portrayal of Clay as a monster. But it was not enough. In 2013, the jury found Clay Starbuck guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Starbuck children, the verdict was a second, devastating blow. They had lost their mother to a brutal murder, and now they had lost their father to a conviction they believed was a grave injustice. Their family was utterly destroyed. The years that followed were a long, dark road. Clay Starbuck has always maintained his innocence from behind prison walls, and his children have never stopped fighting for him. Their fight has been lonely and arduous, fueled by the conviction that the real killer remains free while their father languishes in prison. The tragedy was compounded in December 2021, when their sister, Loghan, took her own life, a heartbreaking casualty of a decade of trauma and loss. But in the darkness, a flicker of hope emerged. In June 2021, with the help of the Washington Innocence Project, Blake Starbuck stood in a Spokane County courtroom and won a major victory. A judge granted a motion for post-conviction DNA testing on the evidence that was never analyzed during the original investigation. Items like the hairs found on Channon's body, towels from her home, and even swabs that had already been tested are now slated for new, more advanced analysis. It was a big win, Blake said, the hope in his voice warring with a decade of pain. There's a lot of unidentified DNA that was found, 3 separate males just on the things that were tested. The case of Channon Starbuck is not over. It is a story with a verdict but no finality, a conviction but no consensus. It is a story of a family torn apart not just by a horrific crime, but by a justice system they believe failed them. As scientists now re-examine the silent, microscopic witnesses left at the scene more than a decade ago, the Starbuck family waits and hopes that the truth, buried for so long under layers of suspicion and sorrow, will finally be brought to light. They are still fighting for justice for both their parents, to find the man who killed their mother, and to bring their father home. Story 8. The Appalachian Mountains have always held a certain mystique for those seeking solitude, fresh air, and communion with nature. For decades, hikers have walked the winding trails through dense forests, climbed rocky peaks, and camped beneath star-scattered skies, trusting in the sanctuary that wilderness provides. But in the winter months spanning 2007 and 2008, That sanctuary became a hunting ground for one man whose darkness would forever stain the serenity of America's national forests. Gary Michael Hilton was born on November 22, 1946, into a world that would shape him in ways both visible and invisible. His childhood was marked by deprivation and instability. A young boy who suffered maternal abandonment and spent time in foster care during his adolescent years. Financial hardship shadowed his early life, and some would later testify that he endured traumatic brain injury as a child. These fragments of a broken childhood would be pieced together years later by defense attorneys seeking to understand how a human being could transform into something so profoundly dangerous. Yet whatever demons haunted Hilton's past, they would manifest in ways that no troubled history could excuse or explain. By the time Hilton reached his 60s, he had become a drifter, a man with no permanent address, no stable employment, and no meaningful connections to the world around him. He lived out of a white Chevrolet Astro van, moving from one national forest to another, camping in remote areas where few people ventured and fewer still would remember his face. He had served in the military at some point in his past, but whatever discipline or purpose that experience might have instilled had long since eroded. Now he was simply a shadow moving through the woods, a figure who blended into the landscape with practiced ease, watching and waiting. His companion during these solitary wanderings was a dog he called Dandy, a reddish-colored animal that accompanied him on his hikes through the forests of Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida. To any casual observer, Hilton might have appeared to be just another aging outdoorsman, weathered and quiet, seeking peace in the natural world. But beneath that unremarkable exterior lurked something far more sinister, a predator who had learned to use the isolation of national forests to his advantage, identifying vulnerable targets and striking with calculated precision. October 2007 brought autumn colors to the mountains of North Carolina, painting the forests in shades of crimson and gold. John and Irene Bryant, an elderly couple from Horseshoe, had spent decades together building a life filled with simple pleasures and shared adventures. At 80 years old, John still possessed the vigor and enthusiasm for the outdoors that had defined much of his adult life, and his wife Irene, 84, remained his constant companion. On October 21st, they set out for what should have been an unremarkable afternoon hike through Pisgah National Forest, a place they had likely walked many times before. The trails were quiet that day, the kind of peaceful solitude that draws people to wild places. But somewhere along those paths, the Bryants encountered Gary Hilton. What words were exchanged, what initial interaction took place, would never be fully known. What is certain is that Hilton saw in this elderly couple not fellow human beings worthy of respect and dignity, but rather opportunities for financial gain. Irene Bryant was killed first, struck down with blunt force just yards from where they had parked their vehicle. The violence was sudden and brutal, leaving her no time to flee or fight back. Her husband John was forced to watch this horror unfold before being taken captive by Hilton, who now had a different plan for him. Hilton bound the elderly man and forced him into his van, driving away from the scene of his wife's murder with John as his prisoner. The terror that John Bryant must have experienced in those hours is almost impossible to fathom. He had just witnessed his life partner murdered before his eyes, and now he found himself at the mercy of a man who showed none. Hilton's motivation was coldly transactional. He demanded John's automatic teller machine card and coerced him through force, violence, and intimidation to provide the personal identification number. With this information secured, Hilton drove his captive across state lines to Nantahala National Forest, another remote wilderness area where human presence was sparse and screams would go unheard. There, in the depths of that forest, Hilton ended John Bryant's life with a gunshot to the head from a .22 Magnum firearm. He left the body in the woods and drove away, already calculating his next moves. The following evening, October 22nd, 2007, at exactly 7:37 p.m., security cameras at a bank in Ducktown, Tennessee, captured a slender figure in a yellow raincoat withdrawing $300 from the Bryant's account. The person's face was obscured, but the height and build matched Hilton's, a silent digital record of theft compounding murder. For weeks, the Bryants were simply missing, their car found abandoned near the hiking trail, their fate unknown to family members who waited and hoped for news that would never bring comfort. Irene's body would be discovered first, but John's remains would not be located until much later, after Hilton's pattern of violence had been fully exposed and law enforcement agencies across multiple states began connecting the terrible dots. While investigators in North Carolina were still searching for answers about the Bryants, Gary Hilton had already moved south to Florida's Apalachicola National Forest, where he was known to camp in the remote northern sections of the forest. December 2007 brought cooler temperatures to the Florida Panhandle, and on December 1st, a 46-year-old woman named Cheryl Dunlap set out for what should have been a peaceful day in nature. Cheryl was a Sunday school teacher and a nurse at Florida State University, a woman devoted to caring for others both spiritually and physically. She had a gentle spirit and a kind heart, qualities that made her beloved by students, patients, and congregation members alike. Her decision to visit the Leon Sinks geological area, a popular spot for hikers in the National Forest, was simply another expression of her appreciation for the natural world and her desire to find moments of tranquility amid a busy professional life. But Gary Hilton was also in that forest, watching and waiting. According to prosecutors who would later present evidence at his trial, Hilton abducted Cheryl from the Leon Sinks area and held her captive for 2 days. What transpired during those 48 hours would haunt investigators and family members forever. When Hilton finally decided that Cheryl Dunlap had served whatever purpose he had for her, he took her life and then methodically set about trying to eliminate any evidence that could connect him to the crime. He decapitated her body, then attempted to incinerate her head and hands in a fire pit, hoping to destroy the means by which she might be identified. Finally, he dumped what remained of Cheryl's body in the forest, leaving her in the wilderness she had come to appreciate and enjoy. Her disappearance was noted quickly by concerned friends and family, but it would take time for her remains to be discovered, and even longer for investigators to piece together what had happened and who was responsible. As 2007 turned to 2008, Gary Hilton crossed state lines once again, returning to Georgia where he had operated before. On New Year's Day, January 1st, 2008, a vibrant young woman named Meredith Hope Emerson decided to celebrate the fresh start of a new year by hiking one of her favorite trails. At 24 years old, Meredith was everything Gary Hilton was not. Engaged with life, connected to community, full of promise and potential. She was a University of Georgia graduate with a sharp mind and an adventurous spirit. She had training in martial arts, a skill that spoke to her determination to be capable and self-reliant. She was an experienced hiker who knew the trails of North Georgia well, having walked them many times before. On that New Year's Day, she loaded her beloved dog Ella into her 1995 Chevrolet Cavalier and drove to Vogel State Park in Union County, where the trails would take her toward Blood Mountain, a peak with commanding views and well-worn paths. The day was clear and cold, perfect weather for a vigorous hike. Meredith moved along the trail with Ella bounding at her side, breathing in the crisp mountain air, perhaps thinking about the year ahead and all its possibilities. Other hikers were on the trails that day, and several would later remember seeing her, a young woman with a dog, moving with confidence and purpose. But they would remember something else too. An older man hiking directly behind her, a man with a reddish dog of his own, following at a distance that seemed just a little too deliberate, a little too focused. That man was Gary Hilton, and he had identified Meredith as his next target. At some point along that trail, he made his move, confronting her with violence. But Meredith Emerson was not someone who would submit easily to intimidation or force. She fought back with every skill she possessed, using her martial arts training to resist, striking at him, trying to break free. Witnesses later heard that the struggle was fierce and prolonged, that Meredith used her wits and her courage to defend herself against a predator who had expected an easy victim. But Hilton was larger, stronger, and motivated by something dark and relentless. Eventually, he overpowered her, binding her and forcing her into his van along with Ella. He drove away from Blood Mountain, taking her to locations unknown, holding her captive as he had done with his other victims. For 4 agonizing days, Meredith remained in Hilton's control, and during that time he would later claim they had spent several good days together, a grotesque characterization that revealed his complete disconnection from the reality of his crimes. Hilton's motivation was financial. He demanded that Meredith provide him with her debit card and personal identification number, intending to drain her bank accounts. But Meredith, even in captivity, found ways to resist. She gave him incorrect numbers, buying herself time, perhaps hoping that someone would notice her absence and begin searching. Friends and family did notice, of course. When Meredith failed to return from her hike, alarm bells rang immediately. She was not the kind of person who disappeared without explanation. On January 3, 2008, authorities located Meredith's abandoned Cavalier. Inside they found her water bottle, a dog leash, and a police baton, items that told a story of interrupted plans and sudden violence. A massive search effort was launched, with law enforcement agencies, volunteers, and concerned citizens combing the mountains and forests, desperate to find her alive. Tips began pouring in about the older man with the reddish dog who had been seen near Meredith on the trail. Within a short time, investigators identified Gary Michael Hilton as a person of interest, and his photograph was circulated widely. On January 4, 2008, Hilton made the decision that Meredith's usefulness to him had ended. He told her he was going to let her go, a lie designed to keep her calm and compliant. He tied her to a tree and walked back to his van, returning with a tire iron. In some accounts, it was described as a car jack handle. What is certain is that he struck Meredith repeatedly over the head with this blunt instrument until she died. Then, in an act of grotesque violence meant to hinder identification of her body, he decapitated her and scattered her remains across the woods. The same day, Hilton attempted to use Meredith's credit card, another critical mistake that would further tie him to her disappearance. By this time, law enforcement was closing in. Anonymous tips reported that Hilton had been seen vacuuming his van at a local car wash in DeKalb County, Georgia. Officers arrived at the scene and arrested him on the spot, catching him in the act of cleaning the interior of his vehicle, trying to eliminate evidence. A search warrant for the van revealed blood stains that would later be linked through DNA analysis to multiple victims, including John Bryant. Gary Hilton was held at a federal prison in Atlanta while investigators conducted a massive search across 90 square miles of Chattahoochee National Forest, trying to locate Meredith Emerson's remains. Days passed with no success, and the pressure mounted. Hilton's public defenders, recognizing the overwhelming evidence against their client, entered into negotiations with prosecutors. The discussions centered on one terrible bargain. Hilton would reveal the location of Meredith's body in exchange for prosecutors dropping the death penalty and ensuring that his dog Dandy would be safely rehomed. On January 30, 2008, the deal was struck. Hilton led investigators to Dawson Forest Management Area, where he had disposed of Meredith's decapitated remains. The coroner determined that the decapitation had been performed post-mortem, a small mercy in an ocean of cruelty. Hilton pleaded guilty to Meredith's murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. When questioned about the crime, he claimed he had been motivated by a desire to access her bank accounts, and he described the difficulty he felt in killing her, saying it was hard because they had spent several good days together. These words, meant perhaps to convey some remnant of humanity, instead revealed the profound psychological distortion that allowed him to commit such acts. But Meredith Emerson's murder was not the end of the Gary Hilton story. Law enforcement agencies across the southeastern United States began revisiting unsolved cases that bore similarities to Meredith's abduction and killing. Hikers who had vanished in national forests, bodies discovered in remote wilderness areas, patterns of violence that suggested a serial predator. The investigation into Cheryl Dunlap's December 2007 murder gained new momentum, and evidence began mounting that linked Hilton to her death as well. In 2011, Gary Hilton stood trial in Florida for the murder of Cheryl Dunlap. Unlike the Georgia case, where he had accepted a plea deal, this time prosecutors were determined to secure the death penalty. The trial revealed the horrific details of Cheryl's abduction, her 2 days of captivity, and the brutal manner of her death. Hilton's defense team argued that there was no forensic evidence directly linking him to the murder, while prosecutors countered with Hilton's own recorded statements in which he discussed disposing of Dunlap's body. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty on 3 out of 4 charges. Their recommendation was unanimous: death. State Attorney Willie Meggs expressed surprise at the unanimous verdict, but acknowledged that if any case warranted the ultimate punishment, this was it. On February 22, 2011, Circuit Judge James C. Hankinson officially sentenced Gary Hilton to death for Cheryl Dunlap's murder, and he was transferred to Florida's death row. The verdict brought some measure of justice for Cheryl's family and community, though no legal outcome could ever restore what had been stolen from them. The Bryant murders, which had occurred first chronologically but had taken longer to investigate fully, finally came before the courts in March 2012. Once again, Hilton entered a plea agreement, this time admitting his guilt in the kidnapping, robbery, and murders of John and Irene Bryant. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole in federal court. During the sentencing hearing, details emerged about how Hilton had killed Irene on the spot with blunt force, then kidnapped John and forced him to provide his ATM information before shooting him in the head and dumping his body. The methodical, calculated nature of these crimes painted a picture of a man who viewed other human beings as nothing more than resources to be exploited and discarded. Gary Michael Hilton became known as the National Forest serial killer, a man who transformed places of beauty and tranquility into scenes of unimaginable horror. He is officially confirmed to have killed 4 people: Irene and John Bryant, Cheryl Dunlap, and Meredith Emerson. But investigators have long suspected that his crimes may stretch back much further, that other disappearances in national forests across multiple states might bear his signature. In 2025, at the age of 78, Hilton reportedly confessed for the first time to Cheryl Dunlap's murder, a confession that came decades after his conviction, when he was already facing death row in Florida. When asked why he chose to confess after all this time, he simply said, "It's time." Whether this represented genuine remorse, a desire for attention, or simply the recognition of a man facing his mortality is impossible to know. What is certain is that his confession provided no new information and brought no additional closure to families still seeking answers. The legacy of Gary Hilton's crimes extends beyond the immediate victims and their families. Today, Gary Hilton remains incarcerated, his name synonymous with the darkness that can lurk even in the most beautiful places. The national forests where he hunted continue to welcome hikers and campers, people seeking the peace and renewal that wild places can provide. But for those who remember the winter of 2007 and 2008, there is always a shadow, a reminder that evil does not announce itself with fanfare or warning, that predators can hide behind unremarkable faces and blend into landscapes that seem to promise only serenity. The story of Gary Hilton is not simply a catalog of crimes, though those crimes were terrible enough to earn him a place among America's most notorious serial killers. It is also a story about vulnerability and courage, about the randomness of violence and the resilience of communities that refuse to let fear define them. It is about investigators who work tirelessly across state lines and jurisdictions to stop a killer and bring him to justice. It is about families who endured unimaginable loss and found the strength to continue, to honor their loved ones' memories by living on. And it is about victims who, in their final moments, demonstrated the full measure of human dignity and resistance, fighting against the darkness even when the odds seemed impossible.